You know what the biggest problem for the empty tomb of Jesus Christ is? Crucifixion victims typically weren't buried. When arguing for the resurrection of Jesus, Christians will often argue that the tomb Jesus was buried in was in fact empty on the third day, because it would have been so easy to disprove it. After all, the disciples were proclaiming the resurrection within Jerusalem, which is the same city Jesus was killed in and the same city he was buried in. If the disciples were saying the tomb was empty and it wasn't, all it would have taken to disprove it would have been a short walk. The tomb is right over there. Let's go take a look. Hey, what do you know? A corpse. Your entire religion is wrong. So Christians will say, because no one did that or even tried to do that, everyone knew the tomb was in fact empty. However, that whole argument assumes Jesus was actually buried in a tomb. As it turns out, when the Romans would crucify people, part of the punishment was the humiliation of having your body left out for animals to eat. Even though you're dead, it's an added disgrace, a situation of adding insult to injury. Also, the Romans left the bodies up on the crosses as a means of deterrent, where the population would see the crucifixion victims and it would make them think twice about committing crimes or fighting back against Rome, because you don't want to suffer that fate. So it would seem that if crucifixion victims were typically not buried, then Jesus probably wasn't buried either, so then there wouldn't even be a tomb to be empty. So the big question for us today is, was Jesus even buried? So first, just to make sure, is it true that crucifixion victims were typically not buried? Seems like it, yeah. We can see different sources during that time and in that area that show the Romans wouldn't bury their crucifixion victims. For this first one from Horace's epistles, he was talking about how pathetic slaves were and that basically their reward for doing their job is not being punished. If a slave says to me, "I've never stolen or run," I reply, "Then you've your reward. You've never been flogged." "I've never killed anyone." "You'll not hang on a cross and feed crows." This is kind of weird and even offensive, but there's a presumption involved here, where if you're crucified, your body will feed the crows. The implication being, the body isn't buried, it's just left up there, which is why crows can feast on it. A similar quote from Juvenal's satire says roughly the same thing. "The vulture flies to its young, bringing pieces of carrion, morsels from dead cattle or dogs, or from crucifixions." Again, the implication here is that the crucifixion victims' bodies were not buried, and instead, carrion birds would feast upon them. Another one, this time from Flavius Josephus's The Wars of the Jews, where in context he's talking about crucifixion victims, he says this: "They proceeded to that degree of impiety, as to cast away their dead bodies without burial." Quite direct, just showing that the Romans were so immoral that they wouldn't even bury their victims. We'll go more into that one later because there's other interesting stuff in that passage. We also see different writings that show us that leaving a crucifixion victim out for all to see was actually used as a deterrent against crime. In Appian's Civil Wars, it mentions this. He also crucified a Roman prisoner in the space between the two armies to show his own men what fate awaited them if they did not conquer. They divided themselves in 4 parts and continued to fight until they all perished except 6,000, who were captured and crucified along the whole road from Capua to Rome. Here you can see the Romans deliberately crucified people in visible places, like along a road for all to see, so that people would see what will happen to them if they act against Rome. Another clear case from Josephus's The Wars of the Jews. Now, it happened at this fight that a certain Jew was taken alive, who by Titus's order was crucified before the wall, to see whether the rest of them would be affrighted and abate of their obstinacy. It's very direct here, saying that someone was crucified right along the wall where people would see him, and the purpose of this was so that it would be a deterrent to others. Lastly, we have a quote from the Pseudo-Quintilian. "When we crucify criminals, the most frequented roads are chosen, where the greatest number of people can look and be seized by fear. For every punishment has less to do with the offense than with the example." For all of these cases, the implication is that if these people were crucified along places where there would be great visibility, then they were obviously left up for people to see. It's not like they were crucifying tons of people along roads to act as a deterrent, but then just took them down a few hours later. No, they were leaving these crucifixion victims up for a while so that everyone could see. This is what you get when you don't submit to Rome. As we've seen from the previous passages, this would result in the victims' bodies being eaten by wild animals, like carrion birds. That seems pretty clear then, that crucifixion victims were left up on the cross and not taken down on the same day, right? Well, as it turns out, it's a bit more complicated than that. You see, while this was the normal practice for crucifixion victims, there were also many cases of exceptions, where the body of the victim would not be left upon the cross. It's not like the Romans were dogmatic that all crucifixions must remain on the cross. It was normal practice, but again, lots of exceptions were made. Here's a few ways that an exception could happen. First, a crucifixion victim would be allowed burial if someone asked for the body. For example, someone close to the victim. The bodies of those who are condemned to death should not be refused their relatives, and the divine Augustus, in the 10th book of his life, said that this rule had been observed. At present, the bodies of those who have been punished are only buried when this has been requested and permission granted. And sometimes it is not permitted, especially where persons have been convicted of high treason. Even the bodies of those who have been sentenced to burned can be claimed, in order that their bones and ashes, after having been collected, may be buried. So if you're a condemned criminal sentenced to death, but you haven't committed some horrible crime like treason, then people close to you could ask for your body, and if given permission, they could bury you. It also explicitly says that this exception was in fact observed. Also, the way this is worded, it seems like it was essentially a right that the victim had, so it wasn't like it was a rare exception, but was even somewhat of a normal practice. Now, that said, I imagine that there would be many cases where no one would want the body. After all, people don't typically want to honor criminals. That said, this is a clear case of a rule in place that quite easily allowed for exceptions, and crucifixion victims could be buried. Now let's look at the story of Jesus and see whether this exception applies to Jesus' situation. You'll notice that the quote says they would be granted permission unless the victim had committed a very serious crime like high treason. What was Jesus convicted of? Did he do something bad enough that the body wouldn't be granted? Seriously, what was he convicted of? Oh yeah, Jesus was part of a useless Jewish religious debate that the Romans didn't care about. You'll notice in John 18:35, what did Pilate say to Jesus when the religious officials brought Jesus to them? Pilate answered, "Am I a Jew? Your own nation and the chief priests handed you over to me. What is it you have done?" What was he actually charged with? Being king of the Jews, which isn't even a crime. We find the trial of Jesus with Pontius Pilate in Matthew 27, Mark 15, Luke 23, and John 18 and 19. In these accounts, we read that Jesus is accused of many things that aren't mentioned, and Pilate can see right through it, that the religious leaders are just jealous of Jesus. Pilate continues evaluating the situation, and we read in all four accounts that Pilate says he cannot find any guilt in Jesus, and that Jesus hasn't done anything evil, and that Jesus wasn't deserving of death. When they demand that Jesus be crucified, and Pilate tells them that he doesn't find Jesus guilty of anything, this is how they responded. The Jews answered him, "We have a law, and according to that law he must die because he claimed to be the Son of God." Pilate doesn't care about that. That's not even a crime for the Romans. In the Gospel of Luke, which typically includes a bit more detail in these sorts of things, because Luke was quite literally researching the matter, we also read that Pilate sent Jesus to Herod, and that Herod also found no guilt in Jesus. When Jesus is finally condemned, he is condemned for being the king of the Jews, which isn't even a criminal charge. He is only condemned because the mob was demanding for it, and not because Jesus was guilty of anything criminal. This isn't really a criminal being condemned for his crimes, so much as it's an authority figure turning his face away to allow the mob to do what they want. In other words, not only was Jesus not guilty of a serious crime like high treason, but Jesus was not found guilty of any crime. And even the charge brought against him wouldn't make him a criminal. And Rome didn't care about it. And the final conviction was for something not even illegal. So, this exception of the body being handed over could easily have happened. But did anyone ask for the body of Jesus? Yup, Joseph of Arimathea did. We see in all four Gospels that after Jesus was dead, Joseph of Arimathea went to Pilate and asked for the body of Jesus, and that Pilate gave him permission. Now, a good question to ask is, why would Joseph do this? Well, in John 19:38, it says that Joseph of Arimathea was actually a secret Christian, but he was a bit too cowardly to admit it because he feared the Jewish leadership. We also see that he was a member of the Sanhedrin, which is like the top authorities within Jewish society at the time, and was also the group that plotted to kill Jesus. We read in Luke 23:51 that Joseph spoke against the crucifixion of Jesus, which would make sense considering he was secretly a Christian. Now, if you're skeptical about all of this because it's in the Bible, here's something important to consider. Joseph, being a member of the Sanhedrin, meant he was rich and famous. Everyone knew who he was. Imagine the writers of the Gospels lying, saying that one of the most important people within the country allowed Jesus to be buried in his tomb. Everyone, including the guy's own family, would have contradicted it. You wouldn't be able to get away with it. Also, because he's famous, it would have been very easy to go find the correct tomb and check it. The whole situation is just so easy for people to contradict or verify that if it was false, it could easily be shown to be false. So, to apply this to the issue of whether Jesus was buried, remember how this first exception worked in Roman society. If the person wasn't guilty of a serious crime, then the body would be granted to someone if they asked for it. What do we find in the story of Jesus? He wasn't guilty of a serious crime, and someone important asked for Jesus' body, and permission was granted. This lines up exactly with what we see in Roman historical sources. A second example for burying crucifixion victims is that exceptions were made when it was a holiday. I have known instances before now of men who had been crucified when this festival and holiday was at hand, being taken down and given up to their relations, in order to receive the honors of sepulchre, and to enjoy such observances as are due to the dead. For it used to be considered that even the dead ought to derive some enjoyment from the natal festival of a good emperor, and also that the sacred character of the festival ought to be regarded. So here we see that, if it was a holiday, the crucifixion victims were sometimes taken off the cross and allowed the honors of sepulchre, or a tomb. To apply this to Jesus' situation, was there a festival or a holiday happening during the time of Jesus' death? Absolutely there was. Jesus was killed at Passover, which was a major Jewish religious holiday that went right back to Moses bringing the Israelites out of captivity in Egypt. So yes, this exception to the rule was absolutely applicable to Jesus' situation. Again, while it was quite normal for crucifixion victims to be left up on the cross, both as part of the insult of the punishment, as well as to act as a deterrent, that doesn't mean it was some hardened dogmatic rule that they always followed. From these sorts of sources, we can see that, yeah, exceptions were made, and it seems like exceptions were even quite common. All you had to do was ask for the body, and you'd likely get it. Also, that crucifixion victims killed before festivals and holidays would be taken down and buried. It even uses the word sepulchre, which implies something like the tomb that Jesus was buried in. There's a third case of exceptions made for crucifixion victims to be buried, and it's probably the coolest one. Here's what we read in Josephus's The Wars of the Jews that we read earlier. Nay, they proceeded to that degree of impiety as to cast away their dead bodies without burial. Although the Jews used to take so much care of the burial of men that they took down those that were condemned and crucified and buried them before the going down of the sun. This is the longer version of the quote that I gave you earlier. Notice here, it's talking about crucifixion victims and what happened to their bodies. It definitely states that, normally, crucifixion victims wouldn't be granted burial. However, Josephus writes that the Jews were an exception to this rule because they cared so much about burying their dead. He wrote that the Jews would take the bodies of crucifixion victims down and bury them before the sun went down. That's oddly specific, isn't it? Why do they care so much about burying dead bodies, even the bodies of the condemned? And why do they care so much about doing it before the sun goes down? It turns out there's a very good reason for this. You see, this is actually an ingrained part of Jewish culture that went back to the law of Moses. This is what we read about this issue in Deuteronomy 21. And if a man has committed a crime punishable by death, and he is put to death, and you hang him on a tree, his body shall not remain all night on the tree, but you shall bury him the same day. For a hanged man is cursed by God. You shall not defile your land that the Lord your God is giving you for an inheritance. If you're thinking to yourself, yeah, okay, but Jesus wasn't hung on a tree. He was crucified. Then I'm right there with you. Except crucifixion did involve the person being hung up on a piece of wood. Either way, the Jews at the time did understand this passage to apply to crucifixion. For the skeptics listening, it's fine if you think that this is all nonsense. That doesn't really matter. My point in quoting this passage is that we recognize the Jews at the time did believe all this stuff. In fact, they treated it as God's divine instructions. So this motivated them to always bury bodies before nightfall, and this included crucifixion victims. You might think, oh, well, we don't know that that's what they did to Jesus. Except John explicitly states not only that they did do this, but it even says that the reason was because of the curse mentioned in Deuteronomy. Here's what we read in John 19. Since it was the day of preparation, and so that the bodies would not remain on the cross on the Sabbath, for that Sabbath was a high day, the Jews asked Pilate that their legs might be broken and that they might be taken away. Here we read that the Jews went out of their way to ask Pilate to have the crucifixions hurried up and finished so that they could remove the bodies. It even gives the reason for this, and it looks like the law that we read in Deuteronomy, where they shouldn't allow bodies to be left up overnight. When we evaluate this exception in relation to Jesus' story, it obviously applies. The Jews believed that it would bring a curse upon their land if they left a body hanging up overnight. We see from Josephus that this caused the Jews to develop a habit where it was normal practice for the Jews to remove the crucifixion victims' bodies before the sun went down. Then we see in the Gospel of John that the Jews present asked Pilate to have the crucifixion victims' bodies taken down because of this rule. We see Roman history and Jewish law both confirming exactly what we read in the Gospel stories. Now, some skeptics dismiss all historical documentation, and they demand archaeological data. I don't know why they dismiss entire fields of academic study like this, but they must have a PhD hiding under their Reddit profiles, right? Well, for those extreme and biased skeptics, we actually do have archaeological data showing that there were exceptions made and that crucifixion victims were buried at times. In 1968, archaeologists discovered an ossuary in the Jerusalem area, which contained the remains of a man nailed to a cross named Yehohanan. An ossuary is a bone box where the crucifixion victim would be laid in a tomb until the decomposition process had been completed and just the bones were left. So they found this bone box with Yehohanan's bones in it. And as you can see, there's a nail going right through his heel, which would have been one of the crucifixion nails. So this archaeological find shows us that in first century Israel, even Jerusalem specifically, the burial of a crucified victim took place, which is in complete alignment with Jewish law, the Roman historical sources, Josephus' descriptions, and what we read in the Bible. So yes, crucifixion victims were usually not buried. However, Roman and Jewish history shows us that this wasn't a strict or dogmatic law, and instead was more of a loose general rule. We then find a few exceptions within Roman and Jewish history, showing that there were many times that crucifixion victims would in fact be taken off the cross and even buried. The first exception happened if the condemned wasn't a terrible criminal and someone asked for the body, and this is exactly what we see with Jesus. Because his crime wasn't even really a crime, and Joseph asked Pilate for the body, and he gave permission. We also see exceptions when it was a holiday, and as it happens, Jesus was in fact crucified during a holiday. There was also the bigger and more general exception for the Jewish people as a whole, where the Jews collectively would remove bodies from crosses so that they could bury them before nightfall. They did this in order to follow the rules found in the book of Deuteronomy, which says a corpse can't be left up overnight. And the amazing thing is that we see this exact reasoning given in the Gospel of John for Jesus being taken down before nightfall and buried. We also have the archaeological evidence of a crucified man's body being preserved, showing that he was buried. We have quite a few exceptions that show crucifixion victims could be buried, and even more impressive is the fact that Jesus' situation falls into all of these categories. Even though I completely grant that crucifixion victims weren't typically buried, it's not surprising at all that Jesus was in fact buried, and these exceptions that we see in Jewish and Roman history prove it to us. Now that we've seen that Jesus was actually buried, that means that the empty tomb seems like a legitimate part of history. So I'd like to ask you, if the tomb was really empty, what do you think the best explanation for that is?